Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. This week, we're going to keep talking about the systems of culture. And in this case, we're going to look at three cultural systems that are common, that are part of cultures everywhere. And that's the concept of the system of kinship, of marriage, which is related, of course, and of romance, which is related to marriage. So when you think of family, what do you think about? What is the size of your family? When you think of your family, stop for a minute and think about that. Your family, what does your family look like? And what do you consider as family? Usually, when we think of family, we think of something like this, just a simple nuclear family, we would call that, of the parents and the children. And when we say to people, I have to talk to my family about that, usually that's what we mean. We don't usually broaden that out within Western culture to a larger group of people. But when you get into other cultures, and perhaps even in your own, it looks a little more like this. It's a network of relationships. It keeps growing beyond that, obviously. And so it may include many more people than just your mother and your father and your sibling. If you look at this diagram, you can think for a minute of all the different relationships that you can see here. Just pause and think, and what are the most obvious relationships that you see here in this diagram? If we look at it that way, we can see there's a lot of different titles that we use for this set of relationships. We have terms like uncle and aunt, or aunt, where I grew up. In some parts of the US, it's aunt, some it's aunt. You have cousins, and you have the cousins' spouses, and we don't have a specific name for a cousin's spouse. If you're married, you have a father-in-law and a mother-in-law. You have brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law, perhaps, but you don't necessarily say grandfather-in-law, although you might. It's just a bit more awkward. Other cultures have specific terms for these things and specific roles that they play, rather than just showing a relationship of they're my father's father. It's a relationship of the influence and specific space that person has in your life. We don't have a term within our language for the relationship between my father and my wife's father. But in some cultures, there is a term for that because it's a relationship that now takes place as a result of the marriage and the marriage taking place. And then we can think about all the different levels of this. We talk about cousins and near cousins and far cousins. Your cousin is your cousin. Your dad's cousin is your second cousin. Your dad's cousin's child is your second cousin twice removed, I think. It gets very confusing. And there's all sorts of terminology that we use, but generally we just say cousin, and I think that's pretty common throughout the world. People just talk about each other as cousins. You might talk about each other as coming from the same family or belonging to the same tribe, or even in some cultures, something like belonging to the same boat, from the same boat. There's a set of relationships, and how we define those relationships is what we call kinship. Here, just real quickly, is my family tree. Here's, you can see me as a picture of the little boy in the center, kind of in the center towards the third row up. This includes my parents and their siblings, their parents and some of their siblings, going all the way back to my great-great-grandfather. We sometimes research that. And as a result of that, we find out that we have a lot of cousins. In researching my own family tree, I discovered that my great-grandfather had a brother who had children. I have cousins I never knew about growing up because my family wasn't that close to them. We didn't know them. And so now, because of ancestry, we're in contact, we share information back and forth, we follow each other on Facebook, we're more aware of each other than we ever were. And there's a sense of legacy there. We're from the same great-great-grandfather, and so it gives us a commonality. In different societies, there's a greater or lesser importance given to these relationships, and that's how we view kinship. What kind of relationships exist, and how important are those relationships? In my own family, I have a cousin I grew up with. His name's Ken. We were together a lot when we were kids. And when I say a lot, several times a year. We played together and did stupid stuff together. That's the one cousin I really knew well growing up. But as we've gotten older, we've drifted apart. We don't have much to do with each other. But two of my other cousins and their kids, we reconnected later in life. And through that reconnection, we have kept that up since then. As adults, we made a relationship where there wasn't one as children. When our kids were in high school, my cousin's kids and my kids were in high school, they built a relationship through a family reunion and kept that up for a while. I'm not sure if they still do. But we kind of have this ability in our society to take less of a permanent concept, especially for an extended family. I think a lot of that has to do with mobility. And if you think about the fact that our society is incredibly mobile and people move, people change jobs and move to different cities. And as a result, the physical ability to remain connected simply isn't there. And as we've said before, when we talked about collectivism and individualism, mobility gives rise to individualism, because once you've been separated from your family, you do need to take more care of yourself. You do need to be responsible for things that otherwise your family might have been responsible for. So when people move, when people become more mobile, they do become more independent. That independence within our culture drives smaller family structures and less concern for the needs and less awareness of other cultures. But when you move into another culture, what you'll find is that in other cultures, those relationships are more important. They are more significant and meaningful because the people within the family function collectively. The opinion of your uncle is a very important opinion. In our society, we may not look to our uncle for advice, especially in an important life decision, but you might. I have had that relationship and seen that relationship in my own family where uncles were influential or aunts were influential. In other societies, those relationships become more significant. When we talk about family, we can glibly just use the word family, meaning something completely different than what they mean in another culture and how they perceive it and what's important to them. So moving on from there, there's a lot of different relationships we can consider when we look at family. That's kinship. And one of the concepts of kinship that you'll find anthropologists talk about is what we call fictitious kinship. And this is where there's a individual who is not physically, genetically related to you whatsoever, but is part of the family. That might be a friend of your father's who you called uncle since you were little and think of as an uncle. And oftentimes, especially in our Western society, those fictitious uncles are closer than our real uncles. We build a relationship with them and think of them as having that level of family and influence in our lives. Other cultures have specific roles where individuals become part of the family through some sort of ceremony, through some sort of event, and as a result of that are considered part of the family and as important in some ways. So this is a family in the Philippines. This is Joseph and Amy Estrada and their children. Amy's there in the middle. Amy was a girl that we hired to take care of our children when we were living in the Philippines. And then she became a part of our household because she was living with us. And then eventually she met this young man who was a teenager when I first met him. His name Joseph. And they decided to get married. When they decided to get married, they invited us to sponsor their wedding. Now, this is an important thing in Filipino culture, to be a wedding sponsor. And as a result of being a sponsor at their wedding, we attended their wedding. We sat near the front with others who were also sponsoring the wedding. And as a result of the wedding, we became part of this extended family. And so the relationship we have with them is that both of them would call me Ninong, and they would call Teresa Ninang. And that relationship of Ninong Ninang is a fictitious parental relationship. It's a fictitious kinship, but it's as if we're part of their life in a family way. And so they look to us. And when you sponsor a wedding in that culture, there's a commitment to stand for that marriage and to protect it, to give advice, and even financial support if needed. This couple doesn't need my financial support. They've done very well for themselves. If I were still in the Philippines, I might have been expected to do things financially for them as they were getting established if their parents could not do those things for them. It's a level of commitment you make. And I think that's one of the things when we first arrived in the Philippines, we thought it was just a thing of honor and prestige. And so people say, hey, you want to sponsor a wedding? Sure, why not? We found out later there were obligations involved in that. We were more cautious after that about who we said yes to and who we said no to, because we recognized that we were actually entering into a familial relationship with these people. They call me Ninong. I would call them Anak, which is a word for child, because they are through the wedding, my children, they are part of my family in that way. Even now, if I went to the Philippines and Joseph is in his 50s and I'm in my 60s, they would greet me something like this. They would take my hand and bring it to their forehead to receive my blessing, because that's how you treat a Ninong in the culture. That's how you treat any elderly person in the culture, actually, but especially when they meet me. And they wouldn't call me by my first name ever. They wouldn't call me Mr. Hartford. They wouldn't call me anything but Nino. It's the only way they can refer to me now. Now, one of the benefits of that is that I also gain other relationships through what we would call co-parents. So Joseph and Amy's parents are both my compadre and comadre. That's from the Spanish term. It's the same concept that you would get in a relationship where you come into a godparent relationship in the culture. I would actually not refer to them quite that way because they shorten it. But when I see them now, I wouldn't call them by first name. I would call them Mare and Pare. And so I have many different relationships in the Philippines who are my Mare and Pare. And I actually have relationships outside of the Philippines because I actually co-sponsor weddings with these people. Tim and Carol Freeman, Stephen Valley Liason. Sometimes we do this, sometimes we don't. You might hear me refer to Steve as Pare instead of Steve. That's because we actually have this relationship of from having been part of the same weddings and entered into that relationship. So we are co-parents of some people. And that is now the relationship we have. It's a fictitious kinship. So I'm related to Stephen Eliason. I'm related to Tim and Carol Freeman, Stephen Val Eliason, through having been a part of a ceremony in which not only was the couple married, but we were joined as family to both families and to each other. So a very important relationship within the Philippines, not to be taken lightly. There are other fictitious relationships you can think of. When the military often uses the concept of a fictitious relationship, of creating a sense of a band of brothers, a family relationship, in order to emphasize and reinforce the relationships within a unit. Similarly, we talk about our family of Christ, and anthropologists would call that an association and a fictitious kinship if we talk about being a family. Now, for us as Christians, we probably would say that in many cases, the family that we belong to in the church is more important to us than our physical family. And in times of persecution and places where Christians are put out of their families because they follow Jesus, the family of God becomes the more important family because they've lost their family. As we go through the Bible, we see many different concepts where we are expected to treat one another as family, to receive one another as brothers and sisters in Christ, and to look to the elders as our fathers and our mothers. For those of us who are older, to look to the Christians as our children, and to have that kind of relationship and obligation to meet the needs of one another, to bear one another, to be for one another. And so many different commands in Scripture that are very familial. And so we would say that we are one family, the family of God. The Bible puts a strong emphasis in that on the role of adoption into the body of Christ, of being adopted by God as sons and daughters, and the concept of adoption being a significant concept. This is the recognized symbol for adoption. When we talk about adoption within our own culture, it generally is considered to be as binding on a person as if they were blood. Even though there's not a consanguineal relationship, as you saw in the book, that term, the relationship by blood, the relationship is as real, as significant, and as important. And as a matter of fact, in American culture, through the adoption process, there's an oath sworn before a judge which says that you will not treat them differently as your own biological children. You'll treat them as if they were your biological children and accept them into the family. So an adoption is considered as sacred and binding. And so when we talk about us being adopted into God's family, that has the same weight of being sacred and binding. And therefore, our adopted siblings within the body of Christ are relationships that we take very importantly. Anthropologists have generally talked about adoption as also a fictitious relationship, fictitious kinship. They don't anymore. And the reason is because it's considered ill-mannered to do so, because our society has put a greater emphasis and a greater value on adoption as years have gone by. This is considered real kinship, even though there's no genetic or bloodline similarity. And then there are other kinds of relationships. When two people get married, obviously they have a family. But when you talk about fictitious relationships or relationships that are non-blood relationships, then you have families that we see in our society and in any society where there are changes of relationship. And so in this image, if a man's wife dies and a woman's husband dies, and then the two of them become married, what are the relationships then between their children? We actually have terms for that, right? And so do other cultures. It's interesting to try to figure this out. What are the relationships and how important are those relationships? How are those relationships seen? How are people treated? You know, you have the old story of Cinderella, where Cinderella was not treated well by her stepmother or stepsisters. They took advantage of her. It became a story to show redemption in a situation like that. Here we have terms like stepchildren, and that's where the dotted lines show a child might refer to the new mother as a stepmother. But if there was children on both sides of the relationship in a blended family, then you refer to your stepmother's children as your stepbrother, your stepsister, not as your brother or sister necessarily. And it all depends on the level of blendedness and how the family chooses to function. If the new couple has children of their own together, then those are not stepchildren. Those are their children, and the siblings don't see them as a stepsister, but as a half-sister. So I have a half-sister. My father was married previously. He was divorced and then married my mother, and my oldest sister is a half-sister. That was what I grew up calling her. Today, as we've built a relationship, we treat her as simply a sister. She treats me as a brother. We don't think of each other as half anymore. We've come to think of each other as siblings. and very involved in each other's families and very, very close, actually. I have a very close relationship with my sister, even though we didn't grow up together. We only got to know each other as adults. And that has to do with some of the ways in which families are treated and the way families treat those relationships. Some other different kinds of marriages that take place, just that are pointed out by the book, that are important to take note of. One is the levirate marriage. And this is a marriage where we see in the Bible in Deuteronomy 25:5, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside of the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate of the elders, and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. So significant commandment in scripture about making sure that women are not left destitute when their husbands die, and that it's a responsibility of the family to take care of that woman whose husband died, and for the brother of that woman's husband to take her as his wife, even if he's already married. So this is the command of God. And you look at that and think, well, that's so bizarre. Why don't we practice that? And it's so good that we don't. I can't imagine. But you think about the time and the customs and the places that this was taking place in. And you had no hope for a woman left alone like that, who was already married, but now was a widow. Widows were not always cared for. This is God's way of saying widows need to be cared for, and the family needs to care for them. Even today, this is a practice in many different cultures around the world. I put in the diagram here some lines to show some relationship. In the levirate marriage, how it's generally practiced is the man will take the wife. He will still have his own family, but he'll take his brother's wife, and they'll produce children. And the children belong to the brother, not to the husband. So even though he is the father of that child, the child is considered the child of the dead father and the mother. And therefore, they're not considered as siblings with the other children of the other family. They're considered more like cousins of the other family, even though they share a father, genetically share a father. But ceremonially, they do not share a father. Their father is dead. Of course, that's simplifying it. There's a whole range of practices in different cultures, the way they do this, but oftentimes you'll find some sort of a levirate marriage. So when we talk about polygamy, we talk about polygamy as a sin, and yet you have this command of God that allowed for polygamy for certain purposes. And so when we get into other cultures where polygamy is practiced, we can jump on it and say, wow, this is awful what they're doing here, but it may actually be that they still practice some sort of levirate marriage, and that's why they have multiple wives. That's not the only reason for polygamy. Polygamy is a generic term, and polygyny is when a man has two wives, and polyandry is when a woman has two husbands. And both happen in different cultures around the world. Polygyny is more common than polyandry. There's also a wide variety within cultures about how the spouses relate to each other. Are the women treated as equal? Is there a first wife? Is she more important than the other wives? What's the relationship of the children to each other? How do they see each other? They raise together. They raise in separate households, all sorts of different things that may occur in different cultures, different ways this is practiced. A lot of reasons for polygamy in cultures are obviously there's an economic advantage in a culture where you're trying to raise cattle and take care of land and take care of the farm. Having a lot of children is important. And so therefore needing more than one wife so that you can have lots of children, sometimes viewed by culture as important. Tibetan culture traditionally practiced polyandry. And they did it for the exact opposite reason. The reason for that was that the wealth of the land shouldn't be divided among families. It should stay with the family. And so if two brothers would otherwise compete for the possession of the land, and there was a threat of the two brothers dividing the land, they would do fraternal polyandry, where both brothers would marry the same wife instead of having their own wives, having separate wives. That way, all of the inheritance stayed within one family, and the two brothers shared the wife. All the children belonged to that family unit. And so it was practiced as an economic conservation of the land. And so there's different reasons people practice this. It's not just simply licentiousness. I think that's where we as Westerners go, oh my gosh, these guys just take in all these wives. There are also political advantages to having more than one wife. Sometimes the reason to take on a second wife is, well, the reason for marriage, the reason for marriage becomes more than just about romance or procreation. The reason for marriage is to align two families, to combine two families, and the political advantage of doing so. That brings us to another similar thing, and that's concubinage. You hear about concubines in the Old Testament, Solomon, obviously, and others. The idea here is that this was not equal to a spouse. In a culture that practices this, they have monogamous marriages, but the man might take on also a concubine. In rare cases, will women take on a male concubine, but usually it's a man. And and so he has a wife, he's committed to that wife, that's his only wife, but then he also takes on a concubine. Well, why? There's a couple different reasons. One is it may be an advantage to the woman. And so she may see it as she wants to bear a lot of children for her husband. She's not bearing children. So as with Abraham and Sarah, she takes her servant, Hagar, and gives her to Abraham. But if you note in this diagram, those children of the concubine are then considered as children of the wife as well. They are her children, and she would be seen as the mother of those children. The concubine is simply the one who gave birth to them. It's, and again, there's huge varieties of practice. We have to simplify this as we think about it. Huge varieties of practice for that. And again, there's economic reasons for doing this, and there's political reasons for doing this. And probably that was with Solomon. A great king would have many concubines and not really pay much attention to any of them because they were simply an act of receiving a girl from her father for the purpose of politically aligning two kingdoms. It's a practice that we have let go of within our culture, but that still actually does exist in parts of the world today. Those are some of the different relationships in marriage, different types of relationships that can exist. So when we think of family, we tend to think of it very narrowly, but there's a lot of variety in what is considered a family in the world. One other issue that we touched on a while ago when we talked about blended family is the issue of divorce. And there's several reasons for divorce. And the result can be very different. In some cases, it results in both parents taking responsibility for the children and sharing that responsibility, even though they've chosen not to be married to each other. In other cases, it may result in the separation of one from the children so that the wife only has the children and the husband no longer has contact with the children, all based on circumstances. And divorce is very common in our culture. It's also common in other parts of the world, but in parts of the world, it's so looked down upon. You have a biblical standard where it's considered a last resort rather than a first resort. And there's a whole lot we could go into that. I really want to honor the people who come from divorced families amongst us and recognize that there's a complexity here that goes beyond this lecture right now. And so I'm not casting any judgments here in the reasons people divorce. And that could be a whole nother dialogue that we could have. And I think there's really some very charitable ways of looking at all of that. And I hope you look at it charitably yourself, because there are circumstances that you can't even imagine sometimes that are the reasons for this. But in other parts of the world, there is no divorce. They might be estranged. They might live apart from one another, but legally they're still married, and officially within the culture they're still married and seen that way. When we get into divorce and remarriage, especially within our culture, where one couple is divorced and then, let's say in this case, the image of the woman remarries and then has children, we see that as a healthy response. And I think it is. I think it's a healthy response for people who've found themselves in a marriage that didn't work. Other cultures in the world would actually look at this as a very negative thing. And anthropologists sometimes call this relationship serial polygamy, meaning that the remarried spouse has more than one living spouse, just not married to them at the same time. Whereas polygamy exists in another culture where a man has two wives. In our culture, a man might have two wives, just not at the same time. So anthropologists actually term that serial polygamy. And traditional cultures around the world that forbid divorce, but allow for polygamy, may see divorce and remarriage within Western culture as absolutely immoral. Whereas we might look at polygamy as immoral, they would see this as worse. So again, different kinds of families, different approaches to family, different marriage structures. That brings us to marriage itself and the concept of romance in marriage. Our society has a very romantic notion of marriage, but as we've said, there are many different reasons that people marry, and within different cultures, some reasons are stronger than others. There are cultures still today that practice arranged marriages, and for us from the West, we see this as awful. How dare they? Why would you let your parents pick your spouse when you were 3 years old and grow up knowing that this is the only person you'll ever marry because your parents and their parents made that decision years and years ago? But in a collective society, there's a purposefulness of marriage is to protect the collective. And so they may practice arranged marriages, even where there is romance between the two and a couple is attracted to each other. They might be able to get married, but they would still need to appeal to their families to arrange that marriage for them and look for the favor of both families so that they could, and have to accept the fact that they couldn't if the family said no. That seems very foreign to us. It's hard for us to conceive of arranged matches as successful or ideal. But for those who grew up in them, when they've been anticipating their arranged marriage all their life, they build romantic notions around it as well. Romance exists within arranged marriages just as much as it exists in our own ideal of romantic approach to marriages. One way to think about this is that we are actually shifting back in some ways to arranged marriages, but not with our family. We're actually letting computer programs arrange our marriage and determine who would be a successful spouse for us. And so that is an arranged marriage. It's still some choice. You still can reject the computer's decision, but we look to that advice of that program. And if the program thinks we're fit, we might be a fit. We should check it out. I think there's anything wrong with that. I've seen several successful internet marriages over the last several years among godly Christian people, and it's worked out very well. All right. And then again, the concept of Western culture, arranged marriages disappeared for us years ago. Individualism as a worldview perspective and value that doesn't need to protect the collective or the collective's wealth, then that creates a situation where the individual is expected to create their own wealth and create their own future, and therefore make decisions toward that future themselves. And therefore, it's entirely up to you who you marry. And so in this environment, two people meet, they fall in love, they make a decision to get married with or without the blessing of the family. And because that's our ideal, we tend to look at any other structure of marriages as impossible or awkward. But the question we should ask ourselves is, given the divorce rate in America, are we actually that successful at finding the right spouse? Which brings in some of the weird romantic notions of our Western culture. And one of those is the myth of perfect romance. I pulled these images off of a short video online. You can look that up if you Google missing half, you'll find it. In a certain dialogue in Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes tells a story, a mythological story. He says that at one time, humans had two heads, four arms, and four legs. And they went about as happy, content beings with this physical structure. At a certain point, they became ambitious and tried to overthrow the gods. And when they did so, the gods responded by cutting them in half. And they fell back to earth and they lost track of each other. And so they were forced then to wander the earth until they found their missing half that they'd been cut apart from. And so the idea of a missing half or a perfect soulmate comes from that notion that somewhere out there is a perfect person made for you. In fact, you were soulmates before you were born in this fight with the gods. That's where it comes from. And so therefore you need to find your perfect soulmate. And you wander around looking for that perfect fit, looking for the person that is exactly fit for you. But what we need to recognize is that comes out of this anecdotal story in Greek philosophy. It doesn't come from the Bible. The Bible doesn't talk about a perfect spouse or a perfect arrangement, a perfect romantic notion of the one true love that you'll find somewhere in your life. But the Bible does honor marriage, and the Bible does honor the relationship of marriage and the fact that a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. And so this idea in our Western romantic notion that somewhere out there is the perfect soulmate and you need to keep looking until you find them is actually detrimental to us. It hurts us because it makes single people feel like they're missing something. They are missing their other half. That's just ridiculous. Like, there are some people who will be single and they need to learn to embrace what God has for them as single people. It doesn't mean they failed in life to find that other half of their soul that's wandering around the earth somewhere. And if only they'd finally met, somebody somewhere out there, maybe there's that person for me. And so it creates an anxiety and it creates a tension and it creates a loss of identity and all sorts of things. It also creates in us this mythology that if we get married and we don't feel like it's a perfect fit, then we failed. We made a mistake. We lost the opportunity to marry the perfect person. We settled for somebody else instead. Reality is that, yeah, there are compatibility issues, and the opportunity to explore those in a relationship before getting married is really important, especially in an individualistic society. But even in an arranged marriage, you can make it work. What it comes down to is that marriage simply takes effort. A little word of advice here, maybe at the end of this lecture. Marriage is something that I like to think of as a dance. When you're starting out, you don't know each other very well. You're not very coordinated together. You don't know all the right steps. You step on each other's toes. You frustrate each other once in a while. But if you're willing and committed, you can learn to work together. You can learn to dance together. You can learn to be together. And it takes, therefore, successful marriage takes commitment, it takes time, and it takes effort. If we're trying to accomplish it from just some romantic notion that we're going to find that perfect person and they're going to be our soulmate and then we're going to step into this relationship without any problems, we're setting ourselves up for failed expectations in marriage. And so even though we think this romantic notion of marriage is superior to an arranged marriage, at least in the arrangement, they know from the beginning that they're going to have to work it out. They know they're going to have to take some effort. And we kind of put it in our minds as well. She's perfect for me, so why would there be any effort? Okay, just a little freebie there. And when you really stop to think about it, this is something important. When two people get married, no matter where you are in the world, the concept of family becomes involved. So you don't just marry a person, you marry into a family. And depending on how that culture's view of family is, that's more complicated or less complicated. When I married my wife, I got her siblings and her parents as part of the deal. I was not completely prepared for how difficult that might be, of having to meet expectations of a whole other set of people and having to keep relationships with a whole other set of people because I married into that family and they had expectations for me as a son-in-law. When you think about cross-cultural marriage, and if you ever have the desire and the opportunity, perhaps, to marry into a family in another culture, be sure you're aware of what those expectations are, because they may be very different than what your culture would expect. And you might find yourself trying to fulfill obligations that you didn't expect to have to fulfill. All right. So why is that important? You may find yourself in a culture where concepts of family are different. And you need to think about how that might impact your relationships with people. As a woman in a Muslim culture, a single woman in a Muslim culture without any male protector, what are the expectations of you? As a single man in a culture which expects men to marry young and you're still single, as a married man in a culture which expects men to have a mistress as well as a wife. And you have to make sure that you don't cross that line and show why it's important. In a culture where public affection between spouses is not encouraged or expected, this was hard for Teresa and I, because in the Philippines, spouses don't show any public affection. And if you get in a culture where affection between single people, even chumminess between friends, is an implication that there's significantly more private affection going on. Or if you're in a culture where you as a son-in-law or daughter-in-law have different obligations that don't exist in your own, understanding how romance, kinship, and marriage work within a culture can help you to more confidently move and be safe within the culture. But it can also help you to understand the problems and challenges that people face and their everyday relationships within their culture, expectations that you may not have on you, but they have. And it'll help you to help them walk as they begin to follow Jesus. All right, there's a lot more we can say, but I'm going to stop there. You have the readings as well. God bless you as you continue to go on this journey. Take some time to look around you and see what are the kinship differences, what are the marriage differences, what are the romance differences between the culture you come from and the culture you're now a part of. All right, God bless.